On the morning of October 14th, 1851, the sky over Harlan County, Kentucky, was the color of a healing bruise, pale amber and violet at the edges, the last warm breath of autumn clinging to the ridgelines before winter swept it all away. Thomas Alder stood in the dooryard of his father's house with everything he owned stuffed into a canvas rucksack and a wool blanket rolled under his arm, and he listened to his brother Josiah tell him that he was no longer welcome. "You had your chance," Josiah said. He stood on the porch with his arms folded, thick as fence posts. His wife Lucille, visible behind the window glass with her lips pressed into a line that could have cut paper. Pa left the land to me and Eldon. That was his final word on it. You want to stand here and argue with a dead man's wishes? You go right ahead. But you won't do it under this roof. Thomas did not argue. He had learned, in 19 years of being the youngest of 3 brothers, that arguing with Josiah was like trying to redirect a river with your hands. You could thrash and push and make a great show of effort, and when you were done, the water would still go where it pleased, and you'd be soaked for your trouble. Their father, Amos Alder, had died 11 days earlier. The consumption had taken him slowly, the way a creek erodes a bank, so gradually that no one noticed the damage until the whole thing collapsed. In his will, written in a trembling hand on foolscap paper, Amos had divided his 160 acres between Josiah and Eldon, his 2 eldest sons. To Thomas, he had left a single item, a leather-bound journal filled with notes, sketches, and observations about the hills surrounding their land. Josiah had laughed when the will was read. Eldon, who was kinder but weaker, had at least had the decency to look away. "A book of scribbles," Josiah had said at the reading. "That's what the old man thought you were worth." Thomas had taken the journal without a word. He had opened it that night by candlelight and read the first page, written in his father's careful hand. "These hills have more in them than any of us have thought to look for. The mine on Ridgebone Mountain breathes warm in winter. I have felt it. Someone should find out why." Now Thomas stood in the October morning with frost on the grass and nowhere to go. He was 19 years old, thin as a rail spike, with dark eyes that people said looked older than the rest of him. He had his father's journal, a hatchet, a knife, a tinderbox, $3 in coin, and the clothes on his back. The nearest town, Bledsoe, was 7 miles east. He could walk there and hire himself out as a laborer, find a boarding house room, and live the way hundreds of other landless young men lived in these hills, scraping by, growing old before their time, drinking on Saturday nights to forget that Sunday was coming. Instead, Thomas turned west, toward the mountains. Ridgebone Mountain was not a proper mountain by any standard that would impress a geographer. It was a long, humped ridge that ran north to south for about 4 miles, covered in oak and hickory and hemlock, with limestone outcroppings that jutted from its flanks like the ribs of some ancient buried animal. Local people avoided it. The terrain was too steep and rocky for farming, too remote for convenient timber harvest, and there were stories, the kind that grew in hollers and churchyards, about strange sounds coming from the old Pershing mine that had been abandoned since 1839. The Pershing mine had been a modest operation, a horizontal shaft driven into the mountainside by a man named Caleb Pershing, who was convinced there was iron ore worth extracting. There wasn't, or not enough to justify the effort, and after 2 years of picking at stubborn rock, Pershing had packed up his tools and moved to Tennessee, leaving behind a tunnel that went roughly 80 feet into the hillside before ending in a wall of solid limestone. Thomas walked west through the rest of that first day, following no trail but the contours of the land itself. The hills rose and fell around him like the swells of a green ocean, each ridge revealing another behind it, each hollow deeper and more shadowed than the last. He crossed two creeks, both running clear and cold over beds of rounded stone, and he stopped at the second to fill the tin cup that hung from his rucksack and drink deeply. The water tasted of iron and leaves. He passed one homestead, a listing cabin with a rail fence and a garden plot already turned under for winter, and the woman in the dooryard watched him go with the flat, incurious gaze of someone accustomed to seeing travelers who had nowhere in particular to be. Thomas raised a hand in greeting. She did not return it. By late afternoon, the terrain grew steeper, and the hardwoods began to give way to hemlock and pine. The light changed, filtering through evergreen canopy into something greener and more diffuse, as though he were walking underwater. The temperature dropped as he gained elevation. His breath made small clouds that dissolved in front of him, like unspoken words. He spent the first night in a ravine, huddled against a fallen poplar with his blanket pulled over his head, while a cold rain tapped against the leaves above. Sleep came in fragments, brief descents into darkness interrupted by the sounds of the forest at night. An owl, the crack of a branch under some unseen animal's weight. The rain, constant and patient, working its slow dissolution of the world. He dreamed of his father's hands turning the pages of the journal, and woke shivering with the taste of wood smoke on his tongue, though there was no fire. The second day he climbed, Ridgebone Mountain revealed itself gradually through the trees, a long, humped shape against the gray sky, its summit obscured by low cloud. Thomas found a game trail that angled upward through a stand of hickory and followed it, his boots slipping on the wet leaves. Twice he stopped to consult his father's journal, where Amos had drawn a rough map showing the location of the mine relative to a distinctive limestone outcrop that the old man had called the Jawbone, a jutting shelf of gray-white rock that resembled a mandible when seen from below. He found the Jawbone at midday and knew he was close. Thomas reached the mine entrance on the afternoon of his second day walking. He was hungry, tired, and footsore, and the sight of the mine mouth, a dark rectangle cut into the pale rock face, partially screened by a thicket of rhododendron whose leaves had curled tight against the cold, was not what anyone would call inviting. The timber framing around the entrance was gray with age, and someone had carved initials into the left upright, CP 1837, Caleb Pershing, announcing his claim to a mountain that would outlast his name by 100 million years. But there was something else. Standing 20 feet from the entrance, Thomas felt it on his face. Warmth, not the warmth of sunlight or a nearby fire, but a steady, faint exhalation of air that was distinctly warmer than the October chill around him. He held his hand out and felt it move across his fingers like breath, the mountain's breath, slow and ancient and impossibly warm. He stood there for a long time. The sensation was so unexpected, so contrary to everything his experience told him about caves and underground spaces, that he questioned whether he was imagining it. He stepped back 10 paces. The warmth faded. He stepped forward again. There it was, undeniable, gentle, continuous. He opened his father's journal to the marked page. The mine on Ridgebone Mountain breathes warm in winter. I have felt it. Someone should find out why. Thomas lit the stub of a tallow candle, cupped his hand around the flame to shelter it from the warm draft, and walked inside. The tunnel was roughly 6 feet high and 5 feet wide, shored up with oak timbers that were still sound after 12 years of abandonment. Water seeped down the walls in places, leaving mineral deposits that caught the candlelight in dull flashes. The floor was packed earth and loose stone, and Thomas's footsteps echoed in a way that made the space feel larger than it was. 30 feet in, the temperature changed noticeably. The chill that had been following him from outside fell away like a shed coat. By 50 feet, the air was warm enough that Thomas unbuttoned his jacket. At the end of the tunnel, where Caleb Pershing had given up on finding iron, the temperature was remarkable. Thomas pressed his palm against the limestone wall and felt it radiate a gentle, steady heat, not hot enough to be uncomfortable, but warm the way a hearthstone stays warm hours after the fire has died. He didn't understand it. Not yet. He was 19 years old and had received a spotty education at a subscription school that met 4 months a year in a log building that doubled as a church. But he was his father's son, and his father had taught him one thing that mattered more than any fact or figure. When you encounter something you don't understand, sit with it. Watch it. Write it down. Thomas sat on the floor of the abandoned mine, his back against the warm limestone, and ate the last of the cornbread he'd brought from home. Then he opened the journal to a blank page and began writing his own observations. October 15th, 1851. Pershing Mine, Ridgebone Mountain. Air temperature inside at deepest point is warm. I estimate 55 or 60 degrees at minimum, possibly warmer. The rock itself is warm to the touch. There's a steady movement of air from deep in the mountain outward, like breathing. The floor is dry at the deepest point. No sign of volcanic activity or hot springs. The warmth appears to come from the rock itself, or from somewhere deeper than the tunnel reaches. That night, while frost crept across the valleys below, and wood stoves flickered to life in every cabin within 20 miles, Thomas Alder slept warm for the first time in 2 days. He did not intend, at first, to live in the mine. The plan, such as it was, formed itself gradually over the next several weeks, the way a river carves its course, not by grand design, but by persistent movement in the direction of least resistance. The first task was understanding the warmth. Thomas spent days exploring the tunnel, tapping at the walls, measuring the temperature at different points by the crude method of wetting his finger and holding it up to feel how quickly the moisture evaporated. He noticed that the warmth was not uniform. The left wall, deeper in, was warmer than the right. The floor at the back of the tunnel was warmer than the ceiling, and there was a narrow fissure in the limestone at the very end, no wider than a man's fist, from which the warmest air seemed to flow. He would learn the science of it later, years later, when a professor from Transylvania University in Lexington visited and explained the principles of geothermal gradient, the way the Earth's own internal heat warms rock at depth, and how certain geological formations conduct that warmth upward more efficiently than others. The limestone of Ridgebone Mountain, fractured and fissured by ancient geological forces, acted as a chimney, drawing warm air from deep underground and venting it through the network of cracks and caves that honeycombed the ridge. The mine, by cutting into this system, had tapped into a natural heating source that maintained a temperature of roughly 58 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, cool in summer, warm in winter, and utterly free. But in October of 1851, Thomas didn't know any of that. He only knew that the mine was warm, dry at its deepest point, and sheltered from wind and rain. It was, in the most basic sense, habitable. He began to work. The first improvement was a wall. Using flat stones gathered from the talus slope outside the mine entrance, Thomas built a dry stack barrier across the tunnel about 15 feet from the entrance, leaving a doorway-sized gap on one side that he could block with his blanket at night. This simple act transformed the deeper portion of the tunnel from a drafty corridor into a chamber that held its warmth. He built a sleeping platform from saplings and hemlock boughs, raised a foot off the floor to keep away from the cold stone at the entrance side of his wall. He dug a shallow fire pit just outside the mine mouth, where smoke could rise freely without fouling the air inside. He fashioned a shelf from a plank of oak bark and placed his father's journal on it, alongside the 3 other books he owned: a Bible, a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe that had belonged to his mother, and a slim volume on practical geology that he had traded a day's labor for at a bookshop in Bledsoe. The geology book changed everything. It was titled A Practical Guide to the Minerals and Formations of the Western Territories, written by a man named Dr. Harlan Reeves, and it was the kind of book that most people in Harlan County would have used to prop open a door. But Thomas read it the way a starving man eats, slowly, carefully, savoring every page. The book described, in clear and accessible language, the principles of geology, mineralogy, and the formation of underground systems. It explained how limestone dissolves in acidic groundwater to create caves and passages. It described the phenomenon of geothermal warmth, and it contained a chapter on the identification of useful minerals. Thomas began to look at the mine walls with new eyes. What he had dismissed as mineral deposits, the dull flashes he had noticed on his first night, he now examined with the focused attention of a student. He chipped away small samples with his hatchet and held them to the candlelight. He compared them to the descriptions and illustrations in Dr. Reeves's book. Most of what he found was calcite, common, worthless in any commercial sense, though beautiful in its crystalline formations. But in a small alcove on the left wall, about 40 feet from the entrance, Thomas found something different. The mineral was darker, heavier, and when he struck it with the back of his knife blade, it produced a faint metallic sheen. He spent 2 days carefully extracting a sample the size of his fist and carried it 7 miles to Bledsoe, where he showed it to Malcolm Crisp, the owner of the general store, and the closest thing the town had to an educated man. Crisp turned the sample over in his hands, held it to the window light, and scratched it with a nail. "I'm no mineralogist," he said, "but if I had to guess, I'd say this looks like galena." "Lead ore," Thomas said. He had read about it in Dr. Reeves's book. "Lead ore with silver content if you're lucky," Crisp said, raising an eyebrow. "Where'd you find it?" Thomas told him. Crisp set the sample down on his counter and looked at the thin, quiet young man in front of him with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and skepticism. "The Pershing mine? Boy, Caleb Pershing dug in that mountain for 2 years and didn't find anything worth hauling out." "Caleb Pershing was looking for iron," Thomas said. "He wasn't looking at what was actually there." The winter of 1851 to 1852 was one of the hardest in living memory in eastern Kentucky. Snow fell in November and didn't melt until March. Temperatures dropped below zero on 14 separate nights. Creeks froze solid. Livestock died in their pens. In Bledsoe, 2 elderly residents froze to death in their cabins when their firewood ran out in January. Thomas, in his mine, was warm. He had spent the autumn improving his shelter with a methodical patience that would have driven his brother Josiah to madness. The stone wall at the tunnel entrance was now 4 feet thick, chinked with clay and moss, with a proper door frame fitted with a plank door that he had built from split oak, hung on leather hinges. He had extended his sleeping platform into a proper bed frame with a mattress stuffed with dried hemlock needles and covered with deerskins. A second, smaller chamber branched off from the main tunnel, a natural alcove that he had expanded with careful chipping. And this served as a storage room for his food, tools, and the growing collection of mineral samples he was cataloging in his father's journal. The warmth of the mine was his greatest asset, but Thomas, characteristically, was not content merely to benefit from it. He wanted to understand it and to use it more effectively. Through a combination of reading, observation, and trial and error, he developed a system that would, decades later, be recognized as an intuitive application of thermal mass heating. He noticed that the air near the fissure at the back of the tunnel was warmest, and that this warmth dissipated as it moved toward the entrance. By building a series of low stone walls, baffles essentially, at intervals along the tunnel, he created pockets where warm air collected and circulated instead of flowing straight out. Each baffle was constructed with gaps at alternating sides, so the air had to follow a serpentine path as it moved toward the entrance, losing as little heat as possible along the way. It was an elegant solution, arrived at not through formal education, but through weeks of patient experimentation, building a wall, measuring the temperature change, adjusting the height and placement, measuring again. He also discovered that certain types of stone held warmth better than others. The dark limestone near the fissure, dense and fine-grained, stayed warm to the touch for hours after the air around it cooled. The lighter, more porous stone near the entrance cooled quickly. Thomas began selecting his building materials with this knowledge in mind, using the densest stone for the inner baffles and the sleeping platform, creating what was in effect a thermal battery, a mass of stone that absorbed warmth during the day and released it slowly through the night. The effect was remarkable. The temperature in his living area, which had been a comfortable 58 degrees, rose to nearly 65. On the coldest nights of that terrible winter, when the world outside was locked in ice and the mercury in thermometers, for those who had them, dropped below zero, Thomas Alder sat in his mine, reading by candlelight in his shirt sleeves. He wrote in his journal, "The mountain gives its warmth freely to anyone who will build the walls to hold it." I think there is a lesson in this beyond the practical one, but I am too warm and too comfortable to puzzle it out tonight. He ate simply but sufficiently. In the autumn, he had hunted deer and wild turkey, smoking the meat over his fire pit and storing it in the cool but not freezing storage alcove. He had traded labor for flour, salt, and dried beans at Crisp's store in Bledsoe. He gathered walnuts, hickory nuts, and wild persimmons. A small spring 50 yards from the mine entrance provided clean water year-round. It, too, was warmed by the same geothermal forces that heated his home, and it never froze, even in the deepest cold. The first lives Thomas saved were not dramatic rescues. They were quiet acts of shelter, offered without fanfare, that accumulated over the course of that brutal winter like snow itself, one flake at a time, until the drifts were deep enough to bury a man. It started in late November, when a trapper named Silas Mooney was caught in a blizzard on Ridgebone Mountain. Mooney had been running a trap line along the ridge and was making his way back to the valley when the storm closed in. The snow fell so thick and fast that he lost the trail within minutes. He was stumbling through knee-deep drifts, his fingers numb inside his mittens, his beard crusted with ice, his vision reduced to a white wall, when he saw a faint yellow glow ahead. Candlelight leaking through the cracks around Thomas's plank door. Thomas pulled the half-frozen trapper inside, stripped the icy clothing from him, wrapped him in deerskins, and fed him hot broth made from smoked venison and wild onions. Mooney's hands were so numb that Thomas had to hold the cup for him, tipping the broth gently between cracked lips. The trappers stayed for 3 days until the storm passed, and during those 3 days, he and Thomas talked about the mountain, about trapping, about the war with Mexico where Mooney had lost 3 toes to frostbite on a forced march in winter. When he left, Mooney clasped Thomas's hand and told him that the warmth of the mine had saved his life. Thomas said only that there was room enough for anyone who needed it. Word spread, the way it does in small communities nestled in hard country, carried by the same invisible currents that carry seed and pollen and rumor. Through December and January, as the winter tightened its grip on the mountains with a slow, implacable strength, people began coming to the mine. Not in crowds, there was no dramatic exodus, but in ones and twos and small family groups, driven by the quiet desperation of cold that wouldn't relent and firewood that wouldn't last. A widow named Martha Hensley arrived in mid-December with her 2 children, a boy of 7 named Samuel, and a girl of 4 named Ruth. Her cabin's chimney had collapsed in a windstorm 3 days earlier, and she had no means to repair it and no husband to do the heavy lifting the job required. She had kept the children alive by wrapping them in every blanket and quilt she owned and burning scraps of furniture in the middle of the cabin floor, the smoke venting through a gap she'd knocked in the daub between the logs. But the cold was winning. The children's lips were blue when Thomas met them at the mine entrance, and little Ruth was not crying, which frightened him more than tears would have. A crying child is a child with energy to spend. A silent child in the cold is a child who is giving up. Thomas gave them the sleeping platform and slept on the floor himself, near the warm fissure at the back of the tunnel. He boiled water and made a thin porridge from his dwindling supply of cornmeal, feeding the children slowly, spoonful by spoonful, letting their small bodies warm from the inside while the mine's ancient heat warmed them from without. By the next morning, Ruth's color had returned, and she was laughing at the echoes her voice made in the tunnel, shouting, "Hello!" and then clapping her hands in delight when the stone answered. An old man named Ezekiel Pratt, a veteran of the Mexican War who lived alone in a cabin 3 miles north, came in January when his firewood supply gave out entirely. He was 72 years old, thin as a fence rail, and he walked the 3 miles through 18 inches of snow, carrying nothing but a fiddle in a flour sack. He had decided, he told Thomas without self-pity, that if he was going to die of cold, he would rather do it walking than sitting in a dark cabin waiting for it to happen. Thomas fed him and warmed him and gave him a corner of the mine to call his own. And Ezekiel Pratt did not die. Instead, he played his fiddle, reels and hymns and ballads he had learned as a boy in Virginia. And the music filled the warm mine with sounds that seemed, in that dark season, like proof that the human spirit could not be frozen out of existence. Thomas sat on the stone floor and listened, and thought it was the finest sound he had ever heard. The Patterson family, Walter Patterson, his wife Mary, and their 5 children ranging in age from 14 to 8 months, arrived in the last week of January. Their creek crossing had flooded during a midwinter thaw, then frozen solid when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in a single night, cutting them off from the town and their nearest neighbors. They had been burning chairs, a table, and the wooden frame of their bed for heat. The youngest Patterson child, the infant Margaret, had developed a deep, rattling cough that wouldn't stop, the kind of cough that in a cold cabin in January could turn to pneumonia and death inside of a week. In the warm, humid air of the mine, sheltered from the wind and the bone-deep cold, Margaret's cough eased within 2 days. Mary Patterson wept with relief, and Thomas turned away to give her the privacy of her tears. Others came. A family of 5 named Bowling, who had recently arrived from Virginia and whose poorly chinked cabin was no match for a Kentucky winter. 2 brothers named Combs, who had been logging on the north slope when a blizzard trapped them above the snow line. A young couple named Ward, married only 3 months, whose roof had collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. An elderly Cherokee woman named Ania, who lived alone in a bark shelter 2 ridges over, and who arrived so quietly that Thomas didn't know she was there until he found her sitting by the warm fissure at the back of the tunnel, her lined face peaceful in the dim glow, her hands held out to the warmth that rose from deep inside the earth. Thomas made room for all of them. He rearranged his walls, expanded his sleeping areas, built additional shelving from split saplings to store the food that some of the refugees brought with them. The mine, which had seemed spacious for 1 man, grew crowded with 10, 15, sometimes 20 people at a time. But the warmth held. The geothermal system that heated the tunnel cared nothing for the number of human bodies it sheltered. It would have warmed an army or a single soul with the same implacable, patient generosity. By the end of February, Thomas had sheltered, at various times and in various combinations, 41 people. He had not kept count deliberately. The number would be reconstructed years later by a journalist from Lexington who interviewed the survivors and their descendants. But the mine's warmth, which Thomas had discovered by following his dead father's written curiosity, had preserved the lives of men, women, and children who would otherwise have frozen in one of the worst winters the region had ever recorded. Thomas asked nothing in return. He shared his food, his warmth, and his space with the openness of a man who had been cast out and knew what it meant to have nowhere to go. But the people who sheltered in his mine did not forget. When the winter finally broke, they carried the story of the warm mine and the quiet young man who kept its door open with them back to their cabins and their towns and their churches, and Thomas Alder's name became, in that part of Kentucky, a synonym for refuge. Spring came late that year, creeping into the valleys like a cautious animal, testing the air before committing to stay. The snow melted in March, revealing a landscape that looked like it had been through a war. Fallen trees, collapsed fences, dead livestock partially preserved by the cold, gardens reduced to mud. Harlan County had survived, but barely. Thomas emerged from the winter, different from the young man who had entered it. The months of solitary work, of careful observation, of feeding others when his own stores ran thin, had tempered him the way fire tempers steel. He was leaner, harder, and possessed of a quiet authority that people noticed without being able to name. He was also sitting on a discovery that would change his life. The galena sample he had shown Malcolm Crisp in the autumn had been sent, at Crisp's suggestion, to an assayer in Lexington. The results arrived in April, carried by Post-Rider, and they were significant. The ore contained not only lead, but a silver content of approximately 12 ounces per ton. Not a bonanza, but commercially viable, especially given the growing demand for both metals in an expanding nation. Thomas did not rush to exploit this knowledge. Instead, he did what his father would have done. He studied. Through the spring and summer of 1852, he mapped the interior of the mine with meticulous care, identifying veins of galena and other minerals, documenting their locations in the journal that now contained both his father's observations and his own. He expanded the tunnel cautiously, following the veins, and in doing so, he discovered something that Caleb Pershing, in his single-minded search for iron, had entirely missed. The mine opened, at its deepest point, into a natural cave system. The cave was not large by the standards of Kentucky's great caverns. It was no mammoth cave, no grand system of underground rivers and cathedral-sized chambers, but it was extraordinary in its own right. A series of connected chambers carved by millennia of water flowing through limestone, dissolving the calcite grain by grain over timescales that reduced a human lifetime to insignificance, extended roughly 300 feet beyond the end of Pershing's original tunnel. The first chamber was modest, perhaps 20 feet across and 8 feet high, with a floor of packed clay that bore the ripple marks of a stream that had last flowed there centuries ago. But beyond it, through a passage that Thomas had to stoop to enter, the cave opened up. The ceilings rose to 15 feet in places. Stalactites hung from above like stone chandeliers, each one the product of thousands of years of mineral-laden water dripping from the same point, depositing calcite one molecule at a time, building downward with a patience that made even Thomas's methodical nature seem hasty by comparison. From the floor, stalagmites rose to meet them, and in a few places the two had joined into columns that ran from floor to ceiling like the pillars of an ancient temple. And the walls were studded with crystals, not just calcite, but deposits of celestine and fluorite that caught the light of Thomas's lantern and threw it back in shades of blue and violet and pale gold. Some of the fluorite crystals were as large as a man's fist, their faces smooth and geometric, their interiors banded with color like the rings of a tree, each band recording a change in the chemistry of the water that had formed them, a geological diary written in mineral and light. Thomas stood in the largest chamber, holding his lantern above his head, turning slowly, and felt the kind of awe that defies easy description. It was not the awe of wealth, though the minerals surrounding him had value, but the awe of encountering something ancient and beautiful that had existed in darkness for thousands of years, waiting for someone to bring a light. No human eye had ever seen these formations. They had grown in absolute darkness, in silence, in the warm breath of the mountain, and they were perfect. They did not need to be seen to be beautiful. They simply were. He spent weeks exploring and mapping the cave. He was careful and methodical, marking his path with chalk on the walls, testing the floor ahead of him with a long stick before placing his weight, noting the temperature and air quality at each point. The geothermal warmth was stronger here. The deepest chambers maintained a temperature of 62 degrees, even in the height of summer when the outside air was sweltering. He documented everything. The journal, which had started with his father's curiosity and continued with Thomas's survival observations, now became a detailed scientific record of the cave system, its dimensions, its formations, its mineral deposits, its air currents, its temperature gradients. Thomas drew maps and cross-sections with a precision that would later impress trained geologists. He sketched the crystal formations with careful attention to their structure and color. He was, without formal training or credentials, doing the work of a naturalist. News of the cave spread slowly, carried by the same informal networks that had brought desperate families to Thomas's door during the winter. In the summer of 1852, Malcolm Crisp visited and was awed by the crystal chambers. In the fall, a traveling minister named Reverend Isaiah Combs came to see the cave and declared it a cathedral built by the hand of God himself. By 1853, people were traveling from as far away as Lexington and Frankfort to see the formations, and Thomas was charging 25 cents admission, a price that was low enough to be accessible and high enough to provide a modest income. But it was the visit of Dr. Anton Schelling in the spring of 1854 that transformed Thomas's understanding of what he had found. Schelling was a German-born geologist who had been appointed to the newly formed Kentucky Geological Survey. He was a short, precise man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an accent that made his English sound as though each word had been carefully selected from a shelf and dusted off before use. He had heard about the cave from a colleague in Lexington and made the journey to Ridgebone Mountain, expecting to find a moderately interesting limestone formation and an uneducated hillsman who had stumbled onto it by luck. What he found instead was Thomas Alder's journal. Schelling spent 3 days in the cave, measuring, sampling, and comparing his observations to Thomas's meticulous notes. On the evening of the 3rd day, sitting outside the mine entrance by the fire pit, while the sunset painted the ridgeline in shades of copper and rose, he said something that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. "Mr. Alder, I have visited caves throughout Europe and the eastern United States. I have worked with trained surveyors and university-educated naturalists. Your documentation of this cave system is more thorough and more accurate than most of what I have encountered from professional men. You have a remarkable gift for observation." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father taught me that when you don't understand something, you should sit with it and watch until you do." Schelling nodded. "Your father was a scientist, whether he knew it or not, and so are you." The doctor's validation opened doors that Thomas had not known existed. Schelling published a paper in the Journal of the American Geological Society describing the cave system and its geothermal properties, crediting Thomas as the discoverer and citing his observations extensively. The paper attracted attention from other scientists and, more practically, from potential investors in the mineral deposits. Thomas was cautious. He had seen what happened when men rushed to extract wealth from the earth without care or understanding: the played-out mines, the scarred hillsides, the streams choked with tailings. He negotiated carefully with a mining company out of Louisville, granting them rights to extract galena from a limited section of the mine in exchange for a royalty on the ore and a binding agreement that the cave system and its crystal formations would be left untouched. The arrangement made Thomas prosperous, though not wealthy by any grand standard. The royalties, combined with the growing income from cave tours, allowed him to build a proper cabin adjacent to the mine entrance. A snug, well-constructed log house with a stone chimney and, by 1856, glass windows. But he maintained the mine as his primary living space during winter, and he continued to expand and improve it with the same patient craftsmanship that had characterized his work from the beginning. It was during this period of growing stability that he met Clara Weiss. Clara was the daughter of a Swiss-German immigrant family who had settled near Bledsoe in 1853. Her father, Friedrich Weiss, was a watchmaker by trade, a profession that had limited demand in rural Kentucky and had turned to farming with indifferent success. Clara, the eldest of 4 children, had received an unusually thorough education for a girl of that era and place. Her mother, who had attended a gymnasium in Bern before emigrating, had taught her to read in both German and English, and had instilled in her a love of natural history that was unusual and, in the eyes of many neighbors, slightly eccentric. Thomas met Clara in Malcolm Crisp's store in the spring of 1855. She was examining a display of mineral specimens that Crisp had set up, samples that Thomas had provided. And she was holding a piece of fluorite up to the window light with an expression of absorbed concentration that Thomas recognized immediately. It was the expression he saw on his own face, reflected in the still water of the spring, when he was studying something that fascinated him. "That's fluorite," he said. "From the cave on Ridgebone Mountain." She didn't look up. "I know what it is. I'm trying to see the banding structure." My mother has a book that describes how the color bands form as the mineral crystallizes. She turned the specimen slightly. There, you can see 3 distinct growth periods. The purple, then the clear, then the purple again. Something changed in the solution chemistry 3 times. Thomas had never heard another person, let alone a woman his own age, talk about minerals this way. He stood in Crisp's store with a sack of flour over his shoulder and felt something shift inside him, like a geological fault releasing pressure it had held for years. "Would you like to see where it came from?" he asked. Clara looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were gray, the color of creek water in winter. "Yes," she said, "I would." Their courtship, if it could be called that, was conducted largely underground. Thomas guided Clara through the cave system over the course of several visits that spring and summer, and she brought a knowledge of chemistry and natural history that complemented his observational skills in ways that surprised and delighted them both. Where Thomas saw patterns in the rock, the way fractures propagated, the way water had carved and abandoned different passages over millennia, Clara saw chemistry. She understood why certain minerals formed in certain conditions, why the fluorite was purple in one chamber and clear in another, why the temperature of the water that had deposited the crystals mattered as much as the minerals dissolved within it. Together, they identified mineral specimens that Thomas had been unable to classify alone. Clara recognized a deposit of barite that Thomas had dismissed as unremarkable calcite. She spotted the difference in crystal habit, the tabular shape that distinguished it from the rhombohedral calcite. And when she scraped it with her thumbnail, it left a white streak on the slate tile she had brought for testing. She suggested, correctly, that certain crystal formations indicated the past presence of thermal springs that had since shifted their course, leaving behind mineral ghosts of water that had flowed 1,000 years ago. On one visit, in July, they reached the deepest chamber of the cave system at the same moment that their last candle guttered and nearly went out. For a long moment, they stood in absolute darkness, a darkness so complete that it was like being inside the mountain's own thoughts, and Thomas felt Clara's hand find his in the black air and hold it, firm and unafraid. When he struck a match and relit the candle, the crystals around them blazed to life in the sudden light, and Clara laughed, a bright, clear sound that rang off the stone walls and came back to them doubled and redoubled, as though the cave itself was laughing with her. "It's beautiful," she said. And then, turning to look at Thomas with the candlelight reflected in her gray eyes, "All of it." Thomas understood that she was not talking only about the crystals. They were married in September 1856 in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church in Bledsoe. Friedrich Weiss gave his daughter away with the bemused pride of a man who had long since accepted that his eldest child would choose her own path. Malcolm Crisp served as best man. Ezekiel Pratt, the old fiddler who had sheltered in the mine during the terrible winter, and who had become, in the years since, something like a grandfather to Thomas, played at the reception, jigs and reels and one slow waltz that brought tears to Clara's mother's eyes. Clara moved into the cabin on Ridgebone Mountain, and within a year she had transformed it from a bachelor's functional shelter into a home. She planted a kitchen garden on the small flat area above the mine entrance, coaxing lettuce, beans, tomatoes, and herbs from the thin mountain soil through a combination of composting, careful watering, and what she called Swiss stubbornness. She hung curtains in the glass windows, fabric printed with small blue flowers that she had ordered from a catalog in Louisville. She arranged Thomas's growing collection of mineral specimens on shelves she designed herself, organized by type and formation date, a system so logical that Dr. Schelling, when he visited again in 1858, adopted it for his own collection at the Geological Survey Office. Their first child, a son they named Amos after Thomas's father, was born in 1857. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed in 1859. A second son, Henry, arrived in 1862, during the darkest year of the war that was tearing the nation apart. The Civil War touched Ridgebone Mountain only lightly, though its shadow fell across the whole of eastern Kentucky. Thomas was too old for conscription by the time the draft was enacted, and his mine, producing lead that was useful to both sides, gave him a complicated position that he navigated with the same quiet pragmatism he applied to everything. He sold lead to whoever would buy it, Union or Confederate, and he kept his opinions to himself. When soldiers from both armies passed through the area, he offered them shelter in the mine, just as he had sheltered civilians during the winter of 1852. He drew no distinctions. Clara, privately, was less neutral. She had read Frederick Douglass's autobiography, lent to her by a traveling bookseller, and it had affected her deeply. But she understood the practical realities of their position. An isolated family on a mountain in a border region where loyalties could get you killed. And she kept her convictions. Like her husband, kept his mineral specimens, carefully cataloged, but not publicly displayed. The years between the end of the war and the coming of the railroad were Thomas's richest period, both materially and personally. The mining operation produced steady income. The cave tours grew in popularity, attracting visitors from across the state and even from neighboring states. Thomas, who had once been a homeless teenager sleeping on a hemlock bough bed in an abandoned mine shaft, was now a respected man, a landowner, an employer, a recognized authority on the geology of the region. But his greatest pride was not in his wealth or reputation. It was in his family and in the knowledge he was passing down. He taught his children the way his father had taught him, not in a classroom, but in the field, in the cave, at the workbench. He believed that knowledge was not something you poured into a child like water into a vessel, but something you helped a child discover for themselves. The way you might help them find a fossil by teaching them where to look and how to look, but letting their own hands do the uncovering. Young Amos showed an aptitude for engineering from an early age, spending hours designing improvements to the mine's ventilation system, drawing plans on sheets of butcher paper with a precision that amazed his father. At 14, he built a working model of a water wheel from scraps of wood and copper wire, and at 16, he redesigned the ore cart track in the mining section to reduce friction on the curves, saving the workers an estimated 2 hours of labor per week. Thomas watched his eldest son's mind work and saw something of his own father in the boy. The same quiet intensity, the same refusal to accept that a problem couldn't be solved if you thought about it long enough. Elizabeth inherited her mother's interest in chemistry and her father's patience, a combination that made her a formidable observer. She spent entire afternoons cataloging mineral specimens with a magnifying glass that Dr. Schelling had given her as a birthday gift, recording each sample's color, hardness, crystal habit, and location in a notebook that she maintained with the same meticulous care her grandfather Amos had given to his original journal. By the time she was 12, she could identify 30 different minerals on site, and she corrected a visiting geology professor who had misidentified a sample of sphalerite as dark quartz, politely but firmly, in a way that made the professor both embarrassed and impressed. Henry, the youngest, was the dreamer of the family. He read voraciously, wrote poetry, and had a gift for language that neither of his parents could account for. Where Amos saw mechanisms and Elizabeth saw chemistry, Henry saw stories. He would sit in the cave for hours, not studying the formations, but simply being with them, absorbing the silence and the darkness and the ancient warmth, and then emerge to write pages of prose that captured, with startling vividness, the feeling of being inside a mountain, the weight of stone above, the breath of warm air, the crystals catching light like frozen music. Thomas and Clara educated their children at home, supplemented by a subscription school in Bledsoe, and by the steady stream of educated visitors who came to see the cave. It was not unusual for a university professor or a traveling scientist to spend an evening at the Alder cabin, eating Clara's cooking. Her Rösti and Apfelkuchen were legendary among the academic visitors, and discussing geological theory with a family that, in any other setting, would have been dismissed as backwoods rustics. The children grew up understanding that knowledge had no social boundary, that a Swiss watchmaker's daughter and a disinherited hillsman's son could hold their own in any conversation, provided they had done the work of learning. In 1874, Josiah Alder died. He was 53 years old, worn out by hard living and harder drinking. His body aged beyond its years by the particular combination of physical labor and spiritual emptiness that consumed so many men of that era and place. The 80 acres he had inherited from their father, the land he had considered the only inheritance worth having, had been sold off in parcels over the years to cover debts. First the south pasture, then the woodlot, then the bottomland along the creek that had been the most productive farmland on the property. At the time of his death, he owned nothing but the house he lived in and the clothes on his back. His wife Lucille had left him in 1868 and moved to Cincinnati with their children, and no one in Bledsoe had heard from her since. He died alone in the house where he had stood on the porch 23 years earlier and told his youngest brother to leave. Thomas traveled down from the mountain for the funeral. There were fewer than a dozen people in attendance, a few neighbors, the minister, Malcolm Crisp from the general store, who came out of a sense of civic duty more than personal affection. Thomas stood at the graveside and said nothing beyond the appropriate prayers. He did not feel triumph or satisfaction. He felt the heavy, complicated sadness of a man looking at the wreckage of something that did not have to be wrecked. A life that had started with every advantage and ended with nothing, not because of bad luck or cruel fate, but because Josiah had mistaken possession for purpose and had never learned to look deeper than the surface of things. Eldon, the middle brother, had fared slightly better. He still held his portion of the family land and farmed it competently, if without distinction. He and Thomas had maintained a distant but civil relationship over the years, and after Josiah's death they grew somewhat closer. Eldon's children played with Thomas's children on holidays. The old wound, if not healed, had at least stopped bleeding. The decade of the 1880s brought changes that Thomas observed with a mixture of interest and wariness. The railroad reached Harlan County in 1882, bringing with it an influx of timber companies, coal speculators, and the first stirrings of the industrial extraction that would transform, and in many ways devastate, the mountains of eastern Kentucky over the next century. Thomas saw it coming. He had spent his life studying the mountain, its rhythms, its patience, its slow processes of growth and change, and he understood, in a way that the speculators from Louisville and Pittsburgh did not, that these hills were not infinite. The timber could be cut, but it took a century to grow back. The coal could be dug, but the scars it left would outlast the men who made them. The streams that ran clear through limestone channels could be poisoned by mine runoff in a season and would not recover for a generation. He began, in the last years of his life, to write about conservation. Letters to the Lexington newspapers, entries in his journal, conversations with anyone who would listen about the necessity of working with the land rather than simply taking from it. He wrote with the same patient, observational voice he had always used, avoiding polemic and letting the facts speak. He described what he had seen: hillsides stripped bare by logging crews who moved through the mountains like locusts, leaving behind a landscape of stumps and erosion gullies where old-growth forest had stood for centuries. Streams running orange with acid drainage from poorly managed coal mines. Soil washing away because the roots that held it were gone. "The mountain does not belong to us," he wrote in one letter to the Lexington Herald in 1887. "We belong to it, or we belong to nothing." Few people listened. The money was too good, the hunger too great, the promise of progress too intoxicating. Thomas understood this. He had been poor himself, and he did not judge men for wanting to feed their families. But he believed there was a difference between using the land and consuming it, between partnership and plunder, and he said so clearly and without apology. But Thomas's own legacy was secure. In 1885, he formally deeded the cave system and the surrounding 200 acres. He had purchased additional land over the years with income from the mine and the tours, to a trust administered by his 3 children, with the stipulation that the cave would be preserved in its natural state and open to the public in perpetuity. The deed contained language that was unusual for its time. It specified that no timber would be clear-cut on the property, that no mining would take place within the cave system itself, and that the geothermal features would be maintained and studied rather than exploited. It was one of the earliest conservation easements in Kentucky's history, though the term would not be coined for decades. Thomas Alder died on March 7, 1893, in the cabin on Ridgebone Mountain that he and Clara had built together nearly 40 years earlier. He was 61 years old. The consumption that had killed his father came for him too, though it took its time, working through his lungs with the same slow patience that Thomas himself had applied to everything in his life. He had known for months what was happening. He had watched his father die of the same disease and recognized the signs. But he did not stop working. He continued his observations, his journal entries, his correspondence with scientists and conservationists, until his hands were too weak to hold a pen. Clara wrote his final letters at his dictation, her handwriting neat and steady where his had become a tremor. In his last weeks, Thomas asked to be carried into the mine one final time. His sons obliged, Amos and Henry supporting him between them as they walked the familiar tunnel that Thomas had first entered as a frightened, hungry boy of 19. The stone walls were the same. They would always be the same, changing on a timescale so vast that a human lifetime was less than a blink. The warmth was the same. The faint breath of air from the fissure at the back was the same. Thomas sat on the stone floor where he had once slept on hemlock boughs, and closed his eyes and breathed the warm air, and was, for a long moment, at peace in a way that transcended his failing body. "It hasn't changed," he said to his sons. "It never will. That's what I wanted you to understand." The end came in the early morning of a spring day, while the first light of dawn was turning the eastern sky the color of pale honey. Thomas had been sleeping more and more in those final weeks, retreating into some interior space the way the mine retreated into the mountain, deeper and warmer and quieter as you went. But he roused himself in those last hours, and Clara, who had learned over 37 years of marriage to read her husband's silences as fluently as other women read their husbands' words, leaned close. "There's always more to find," Thomas said. His voice was a whisper, thin as the air at the top of the ridge. "Tell them to keep looking." He died with Clara's hand in his, in a room warmed not by fire, but by the same ancient geological forces he had spent his life studying and respecting. The mine, 80 feet away through solid rock, breathed its warm breath into the morning air, the same way it had breathed on the October day when a homeless 19-year-old boy had first felt it on his face. They buried him on the slope above the mine entrance, in a plot he had chosen himself, beneath a hickory tree that had been old when he arrived on the mountain. The gravestone was cut from the same limestone that formed the cave walls. A piece of the mountain returned to the mountain's surface. Clara chose the inscription. He looked deeper. Clara outlived Thomas by 14 years, dying in 1907 at the age of 72. She spent those years maintaining the cave tours, expanding the mineral collection, and corresponding with scientists across the country about the geological features of Ridgebone Mountain. She published 3 papers in scientific journals under her own name, an achievement that was remarkable for a woman of her era and background, and she was invited to speak at the Kentucky Academy of Science in 1903, the first woman to address that body. She spoke about geothermal systems, about conservation, and about the importance of teaching children to observe the natural world with care and wonder. She did not mention that she had learned most of what she knew in a cave, by candlelight, alongside a man who had been told he was worth nothing more than a book of scribbles. She didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. Young Amos became a mining engineer and worked throughout Appalachia, earning a reputation for designing mines that were safer and less environmentally destructive than the standard of the day. He attributed his approach to his father's example. Elizabeth married a professor of chemistry at Berea College and spent her life teaching and conducting research. Henry, the dreamer, became a writer. His novel, The Warm Dark, published in 1901, was a fictionalized account of his father's early years on Ridgebone Mountain, and it remains in print today, a quiet classic of Appalachian literature. The cave on Ridgebone Mountain is still open to visitors. The crystal chambers are as beautiful as they were when Thomas first held his lantern up in the darkness and saw the light thrown back in shades of blue and violet and pale gold. The geothermal system still works, maintaining a steady 58 to 62 degrees year-round. The mining operation ceased in 1911, but the tunnel Thomas expanded and the walls he built are still standing, a testament to the craftsmanship of a man who was taught that patience and observation were worth more than any inheritance. On the wall near the entrance, preserved behind glass, is a page from the original journal. Amos Alder's handwriting, faded but legible after more than a century and a half. These hills have more in them than any of us have thought to look for. His son found out what that meant. And 41 people, in the worst winter of their lives, found warmth in a mountain because a boy who was told he was worthless decided to look deeper. There is a principle in geology called uniformitarianism, the idea that the forces shaping the earth today are the same forces that have always shaped it. Water dissolves limestone at the same rate it always has. Heat rises through fractured rock the way it always will. The processes are slow, patient, and relentless, and they build things, caves, crystals, mountains, that endure for millennia. Thomas Alder lived his life according to a similar principle, though he would never have used the word. He believed that steady work, careful observation, and respect for the natural world would, over time, build something lasting. He was right. The cave endures. The crystals grow still, adding imperceptible layers each year to formations that began before humans walked the earth. The warmth rises from deep in the mountain, as it always has and always will, indifferent to the seasons, indifferent to the opinions of men who thought a young man with a book of scribbles was worthless. Surviving is building. Thomas Alder knew that before he had words for it. He knew it the way the mountain knows to breathe warm air into the cold, not because it chooses to, but because that is its nature, and nature, given patience and time, always provides.